All right, let's just jump right in. Take a second and read this quote on your screen. It's from John Burgess, a hugely influential political scientist at one of America's top universities. His ideas reached thousands, so this wasn't some fringe opinion. This was mainstream thought.
And for generations, this idea that Black Americans were just incapable of governing themselves was the accepted story of Reconstruction. It was the official narrative taught in schools, a story of failure and corruption that was used to justify everything that came next.
But what if that entire story was a deliberate lie? What if, as the incredible scholar W.E.B. Du Bois argued, it was all just propaganda designed to hide the truth of a successful, progressive, working-class government that wasn't overthrown because it failed, but because it was working all too well? That's the story we're going to unpack. To do that, we have to go to South Carolina. Right after the Civil War, it was this unique place. For the very first time in American history, a state with a Black majority actually had real political power. Du Bois saw this as this profound experiment, a government that would be shaped by the needs of its biggest group of workers, the people who had just been freed from slavery. I mean, the numbers here tell a revolutionary story all by themselves. Look at this. In 1867, you've got over 80,000 registered Black voters and less than 47,000 white voters. That's not just a shift in power, that is a complete 180-degree flip of the old social order. You can just imagine the pure terror this caused for the old planter class. Du Bois actually used a really provocative phrase for this. He called it a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, he wasn't talking about violent tyranny or anything like that. No, for him, it meant that for this one brief, shining moment, the state was actually being run for the benefit of its working majority. Instead of for a handful of wealthy elites, it was a true labor-led democracy. So they have the power. What did they actually do with it? Well, their actions completely shatter that myth of incompetence. Let's look at the Constitutional Convention in 1868. 76 of the 124 delegates there were Black men. Most of them were former slaves. And check out what they came up with. The Constitution they wrote was one of the most progressive in the entire country. It created free public schools for all children for the first time in the state's history. It got rid of the rule that you had to own property to vote. It ended debtors' prisons, reformed the courts. It even created the state's first divorce law. And a lot of these laws were so good they stayed on the books for decades, even after Reconstruction was destroyed. So what was the attitude of these new leaders? Well, just listen to this from Beverly Nash, who had been a slave. There's no arrogance here. It's just this profound humility and determination. He's saying, look, we're new to this, but we can learn. We'll figure it out. It's the exact opposite of the power-hungry cartoon character his opponents tried to paint him as. Right. So the main point here is that these were not ignorant buffoons, not even close. If you read the records from the convention, you see these incredibly sophisticated debates happening. Men like Ethel Cardozo were leading discussions on huge issues like compulsory education and land reform. They were doing the serious, thoughtful work of building a modern state. And that right there brings us to the real heart of the conflict. The vicious opposition to this new government, it wasn't really about incompetence. According to Du Bois, it was about something much simpler. It was about economics. It was a war over wealth. I mean, think about it. For the very first time, the property of the richest people in the state was being taxed to pay for public services that helped everyone, especially the poor. Things like public schools for both Black and white children. The rage wasn't really against bad government. It was against the very idea that poor people could tax rich people to build a better society for everybody. And the planter class didn't just complain. They fought back with organized economic warfare. They held public meetings where they passed resolutions like these. They all agreed they wouldn't hire any Black worker unless he had a permission slip from his old master. They swore they wouldn't rent land to Black families. This was a calculated campaign to force Black labor back into a state of near slavery. And if you need a smoking gun for their real motives, this is it. This proposal came from what they called the Taxpayers' Convention. They openly suggested a system where the votes of 60,000 property owners would be worth the same as the votes of 90,000 people who didn't own property. This was a blatant attempt to kill the whole idea of one person, one vote, and make sure that money, not people, ran the state. Okay, but what about all the corruption? That's the charge that stuck to Reconstruction for more than 100 years. Du Bois doesn't deny that it happened, but he forces us to look closer, to get the real context, and to untangle the myth from the reality. So on the left, you see the charge we've all heard, out-of-control corruption by these new black lawmakers. But on the right, you see the context. Corruption and bribery, especially around railroads, were a national plague during this era. It was happening everywhere, in the North, in the federal government. What happened in South Carolina wasn't unique. It was just part of a much bigger nationwide problem. And who was actually doing the bribing? This quote is just incredible. It's from a white Democrat, a guy who was an opponent of the government, and he says it right there in black and white. Some of our own household, respected white elites, were the ones paying the bribes. They were the ones driving the corruption. You know, a big chunk of the state's debt wasn't even from misspending. It was the direct result of economic sabotage. The old elite constantly threatened that if they ever got back in power, they just wouldn't pay back the state's loans. Well, that completely tanked South Carolina's credit, which forced the government to borrow money from northern banks at insane interest rates, sometimes as high as 18%. And all of this leads us to Du Bois's final devastating conclusion. The South Carolina experiment in democracy didn't fail. It was systematically, deliberately, and violently destroyed. This timeline just shows clear progress. You've got a great constitution in 68. The economy is recovering by 1870. By 74, there's a reform movement, backed by black leaders, that elects a governor who's actually cracking down on corruption. The system was correcting itself. It was working. And then, just 2 years later, it was crushed by organized terror and fraud. It didn't collapse. It was pushed off a cliff. And here's the ultimate proof that it was a good government. Du Bois points out that the laws they passed were fundamentally solid. And how do we know that? Because when the white counter-revolutionaries seized power, they kept most of those laws on the books for decades, including the public school system. The laws worked. This quote from a black lawmaker speaking in 1895, at the very moment he was about to be stripped of his right to vote, just says it all. He points to the laws they passed, the lasting reforms, as living witnesses to their ability to govern. It's just a powerful, heartbreaking testament to a legacy that was being deliberately erased from history. And so we're left with this question. For a century, the story of Reconstruction was written by its enemies, by people like John Burgess from the very beginning. But when we dig into the archives, when we actually listen to Du Bois, to Beverly Nash, to the men who built that government, the entire story changes. It becomes a story not of failure, but of a promise that was tragically broken. It really makes you wonder, how many other parts of our story would change if we only chose to listen?